You wake to the sound of church bells echoing across the valley, but something feels wrong. It's October 1348, and you're lying on a straw mattress in your family's one-room cottage in the village of Millbrook, somewhere in the English countryside. The bells aren't ringing for morning prayers. They've been ringing since before dawn, a constant, mournful toll that makes your stomach twist with dread. You pull the rough wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, trying to block out the sound, but it seeps through the gaps in the wooden walls like cold wind. Your father is already awake, sitting by the dying embers of last night's fire. His weathered hands shake as he tries to coax flames from the ash, and you can see the fear in his eyes even from across the room. He hasn't slept well in weeks, none of you have. The stories have been reaching your village for months now, carried by merchants and traveling priests, tales of a great dying sweeping across the continent like God's own wrath. Cities emptied overnight, entire families found dead in their homes. Bodies piling up in the streets, because there aren't enough living souls left to bury them. But Millbrook has been safe, remote, hidden in its little valley like a secret, until now. You sit up slowly, your joints aching from the cold and damp. The autumn air carries a strange sweetness today, mixed with the usual smells of wood smoke and animal dung. It takes you a moment to realize what that sweetness is, the smell of too many flowers, too many funeral wreaths. Your stomach drops as understanding hits you like a physical blow. The sickness has arrived. Your mother moves quietly around the cottage, preparing the morning meal with mechanical precision. Her face is pale, drawn tight with worry, and she keeps glancing toward the door as if expecting death itself to come knocking. The wooden bowl in her hands trembles slightly as she ladles out the thin porridge. There's less grain than usual. There's been less of everything lately. Trade has slowed to a trickle as towns and cities close their gates, and the harvest was poor this year, even without the specter of plague hanging over everything. You force yourself to eat, though the porridge tastes like ash in your mouth. Through the single window, you can see your neighbors beginning their daily routines, but everything feels different now. Thomas the blacksmith isn't hammering at his forge with his usual enthusiasm. Old Margaret isn't tending to her chickens with her customary complaints about their laying. Even the children seem subdued, clustering close to their mothers instead of running wild through the muddy lanes. The bells continue their relentless tolling, and finally you have to ask, who? The word comes out as barely a whisper, but your father hears it anyway. He looks up from the fire, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and grief. "The miller's boy," he says simply. "Little William. Found him this morning when his father went awake him for work." Your heart clenches. William couldn't have been more than 12 years old, always laughing, always getting into mischief with the other children. Just last week he'd helped you carry water from the well, chattering excitedly about the harvest festival that now seems like a lifetime ago. Your mother sets down her bowl with shaking hands. "It started with fever," she says, her voice barely audible. "Then the swellings, under his arms, they say, black as coal." She crosses herself, lips moving in silent prayer. You've heard the descriptions before, whispered in terrified conversations around village fires. The buboes, they call them. Egg-sized lumps that appear seemingly overnight, hard and painful and invariably fatal. You push your porridge away, no longer able to force it down. Through the window, you can see a small procession moving toward the churchyard. William's parents walking behind Father Edmund, their shoulders shaking with grief. They're the only mourners. In normal times, the entire village would have turned out for the funeral of a child. But these aren't normal times. People are afraid to gather, afraid to breathe the same air, afraid to touch anything the dead might have touched. Your father stands up abruptly, his face grim with determination. "We need to leave," he says, and your mother looks up sharply. "Today, before it spreads further." You can see the logic in his words, but the thought of abandoning everything you've ever known fills you with a different kind of terror. This cottage, crude as it is, has been your family's home for 3 generations. The fields outside are the only ones you've ever worked. The faces in the village are the only ones you've ever known. But you've also heard what happens to places touched by the pestilence. Villages emptied of life, fields left unharvested, animals starving in their pens because there's no one left to tend them. The lucky ones are those who die quickly. The unlucky ones watch their entire world crumble around them before the sickness finally claims them too. Your mother's voice is small and frightened when she speaks. "Where would we go? Every road leads somewhere the death has already been. Every town, every city." She trails off, unable to finish the thought. She's right, of course. The plague has spread faster than anyone thought possible, racing along trade routes and river valleys with terrifying efficiency. There's nowhere to run that might not already be infected. Your father runs a hand through his graying hair, looking older than his 40-odd years. "My brother in the north," he says finally. "Hugh's farm up in the mountains. It's isolated, far from the main roads, if anywhere is safe." He doesn't finish the sentence, but the implication hangs in the air like incense smoke. If anywhere is safe, it might be there. You think of Uncle Hugh, your father's younger brother who chose the hard life of a hill farmer over the relative comfort of village life. You haven't seen him in 2 years, not since he came down for your cousin's wedding. He's a hard man, weathered by wind and snow, but kind enough in his way. His farm is indeed isolated, perched on a mountainside so remote that even the tax collectors sometimes forget it exists. The decision, when it comes, feels inevitable. You'll leave at midday when the sun is highest and the roads are driest. You'll take only what you can carry, some food, a change of clothes, your father's tools, your mother's prayer book. Everything else, all the accumulated possessions of a lifetime, will have to stay behind. The cottage will stand empty, another casualty of the great dying. Packing feels surreal, like preparing for your own funeral. You fold your second-best tunic, the one your mother embroidered with careful stitches last winter when there was still time for such things. You wrap your few possessions in a piece of cloth, a wooden cup carved by your grandfather, a small knife your father gave you for your last birthday, a smooth stone you found by the river when you were 7 and somehow never threw away. Your mother packs the food with the methodical care of someone who knows it might have to last for days. Hard bread, dried meat, a small wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth, a leather pouch of salt, more precious than silver in times like these, a ceramic jug for water, stoppered with wax to keep it clean. It's not much, but it's all you have. The sun climbs higher as you make your final preparations, and with it comes the sound of more bells. Another death in another family. The sweet smell in the air grows stronger, mixed now with the acrid smoke of burning thatch, someone's cottage being cleansed with fire after its occupants succumbed. You try not to think about which of your neighbors might be inside. Just before noon, there's a knock at your door. You freeze, all of you, hearts pounding with sudden terror. In normal times, a knock would mean a neighbor seeking help or company. But these aren't normal times, and everyone knows the stories of families found dead behind doors they never opened again. Your father approaches the door slowly, his hand resting on the handle of his eating knife. "Who is it?" he calls out, his voice steady despite the fear you can see in his shoulders. "It's Robert," comes the muffled reply. "Robert the baker, a man you've known since childhood." Your father relaxes slightly, lifting the wooden bar that secures the door. Robert steps inside, and you can immediately see that something is terribly wrong. His usually ruddy face is pale and drawn, and there are dark circles under his eyes that speak of sleepless nights and overwhelming grief. "My Mary," he says without preamble, and your mother gasps. Mary was Robert's wife, a plump, cheerful woman who always had a kind word for everyone and baked the finest bread in 3 villages. This morning, the fever took her in the night. His voice cracks on the words, and you can see him struggling to maintain his composure. Your parents exchange glances, the same thought occurring to all of you at once. If Mary is dead, how many others are infected? How far has the sickness spread through the village while you slept? Robert seems to read your thoughts, his expression growing even grimmer. "It's not just Mary," he continues. "The Cooper's family, all of them, old Henrik at the mill, the widow Constance and her daughters." He recites the names like a funeral litany, each one hitting you like a physical blow. These are people you've known your entire life, faces you've seen at market and church and harvest celebrations. The village you woke up in this morning already no longer exists. Your father makes the decision quickly. "We're leaving," he tells Robert. "For the mountains, you should come with us." But Robert shakes his head, a sad smile crossing his weathered face. "Too late for me," he says simply, and rolls up his sleeve to show you the swelling that has appeared under his left arm. It's smaller than an egg, but unmistakably the mark of the pestilence, dark and hard and radiating heat even from where you stand. "Noticed it this morning when I was washing Mary for burial. Reckon I have a day, maybe 2. The sight of the bubo fills you with a primal terror that goes deeper than rational thought. This is death made visible, the enemy that has stalked your nightmares for months now standing in your own home. You want to run, to get as far away from Robert as possible, but you also feel a crushing wave of pity for this man who has been like an uncle to you. Your mother, bless her, steps forward and places a gentle hand on Robert's shoulder. "Then you should rest," she says softly. "Go home and rest, and we'll—" She stops, unable to finish. What can you say to a man who's been handed his death sentence by the very air he breathes? Robert nods gratefully. "I just wanted to warn you," he says, "to tell you to get out while you still can. Don't make the mistake the rest of us made, thinking we could weather this storm like all the others." He turns to go, then pauses at the door. "Your Uncle Hugh," he says to your father. "He always was the smart one, choosing the high country. Maybe he had the right idea all along." After he leaves, the silence in the cottage feels oppressive. You can hear your own heartbeat, your mother's quick, shallow breathing, the crackle of the dying fire. Outside, the bells continue their mournful song, joined now by the sound of women weeping and men digging graves in ground that wasn't frozen yet but would be soon. Your father breaks the silence first. "We leave now," he says, his voice brooking no argument. "Right now, while we still can." He hefts the bundle of supplies he's prepared, testing its weight. Your mother clutches her prayer book to her chest like a shield, lips moving in continuous, silent prayer. You take one last look around the cottage that has been your entire world. The hearth where you've sat on countless winter evenings, listening to your father's stories and your mother's songs. The corner where you slept as a child, before you grew too big and had to move to the loft. The wooden table where your family has shared thousands of meals, scraped and stained by years of use, but solid and familiar and safe. It's hard to believe you'll never see any of it again. The door closes behind you with a finality that echoes in your chest. You step out into the October afternoon, and immediately the full scope of the disaster becomes apparent. The village that was so familiar this morning has transformed into something alien and terrifying. Smoke rises from at least 3 cottages, black columns against the gray sky. You can see bodies wrapped in sheets being carried toward the churchyard, more than the small cemetery was ever meant to hold. A group of children huddles near the well, their parents nowhere to be seen. They look lost and frightened, unsure of what to do or where to go. One of them, a girl no older than 8, is crying for her mother in a voice that tears at your heart. You want to help them, to gather them up and take them with you, but you know that's impossible. You're barely managing to save yourselves. The walk through the village feels like a funeral march. Every door you pass might hide another family in their death throes. Every face you see might be the last time you'll ever see it alive. The few people who are still moving about do so with the quick, furtive motions of the deeply frightened, avoiding eye contact and giving each other wide berth as they go about the grim business of survival. At the edge of the village, you pass the church where you were baptized as an infant. Father Edmund is in the graveyard, bent over a spade, sweat streaming down his face despite the cool air. There are already too many graves for one man to dig, and more bodies waiting under white sheets. He looks up as you pass, his eyes filled with an exhaustion that goes far beyond the physical. "Go with God," he calls out, and you can hear the weight of genuine blessing in his voice. He knows you're fleeing, and he doesn't blame you for it. If anything, there's a note of envy in his tone, the wistful sound of a man who wishes he could abandon his duties and save himself. The road north is little more than a dirt track, rutted by cart wheels and hoofprints, winding up into the hills where the trees grow thick and the air grows thin. You've traveled this way before, but never with such desperate urgency. Every step takes you farther from everything you've ever known, deeper into an uncertain future where survival itself is far from guaranteed. The first mile passes in relative silence, broken only by the sound of your feet on the muddy road and the distant tolling of the village bells growing fainter behind you. Your mother walks with her head down, clutching her prayer book, lips moving in constant supplication. Your father keeps looking back over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit, though you all know the only thing following you is death itself. As the afternoon wears on, you begin to encounter other travelers. A family with a cart pulled by a scrawny ox, their possessions piled high and their faces drawn with exhaustion. A group of monks walking in silence, their brown robes dusty from the road. A merchant with his guards, their hands resting uneasily on their sword hilts as they eye every stranger with suspicion. None of you speak to each other beyond the briefest of greetings. In normal times, meeting fellow travelers would be an occasion for sharing news and stories, perhaps even traveling together for safety and companionship. But these aren't normal times. Every stranger might be carrying the pestilence in their blood, spreading death with every breath. Trust has become a luxury none of you can afford. By late afternoon, your legs are beginning to ache and your stomach is growling despite your lack of appetite. The road has climbed steadily upward, leaving the familiar farmland behind for wilder country, where the trees grow closer to the path and the undergrowth rustles with unseen movement. This is border country, the edge of the civilized world where wolves still hunt and bandits prey on unwary travelers. Your father calls a halt beside a small stream, the first clean water you've seen since leaving the village. The three of you drink deeply, refilling your water jug and splashing the cold mountain water on your faces. The brief rest feels like a luxury, but you all know you can't linger long. Night falls quickly in the mountains, and you need to find shelter before full darkness arrives. As you're preparing to resume your journey, you hear voices on the road behind you. A group of travelers approaching fast, their voices raised in what sounds like argument or panic. Your father immediately moves to shield you and your mother behind a large oak tree, his hand going to his knife. In times like these, desperation can make even good people dangerous, and there's no telling what desperate people might do for food or shelter or simply the illusion of safety. The voices grow clearer as the group approaches, and you can make out individual words now. They're speaking of plague, of villages emptied and roads blocked by bodies. One voice, higher than the others, is sobbing uncontrollably. Another is shouting about God's wrath and the end of days. A third is trying to maintain some semblance of calm, urging the group to keep moving and find shelter before dark. Through the trees, you catch glimpses of them as they pass. Perhaps a dozen people, maybe more. A ragged collection of families who have banded together for mutual protection. They have carts and pack animals, more supplies than your small family could ever hope to carry. But they also look exhausted and frightened, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed look of people who have seen too much death and suffering. One of the carts carries what looks like a body wrapped in white cloth, and the sight sends a chill through you that has nothing to do with the mountain air. These people are traveling with their dead, unable to stop long enough for proper burial, afraid that any delay might doom the living as well. It's a violation of every natural law and Christian teaching, but it's also a stark reminder of how completely the normal world has collapsed. After they pass, your small family emerges from hiding and continues up the road in silence. The encounter has shaken all of you, driving home the reality that you're not the only ones fleeing the pestilence. The roads are full of refugees now, all of them carrying their fear and desperation like a burden that grows heavier with each mile. The sun is beginning to set behind the mountains when you finally reach a place your father recognizes. It's a small clearing beside the road where he and his brother used to camp when they were young men, traveling to market with their father's goods. There's a ring of stones for a fire and a small linta that might provide some shelter from the wind. It's not much, but it's better than spending the night in the open with wolves and bandits and plague refugees sharing the darkness. Building a fire becomes an urgent priority as the temperature drops with the sun. Your father coaxes flames from dry tinder, while you and your mother gather firewood from the edge of the clearing. The work feels good after the long day of walking, giving your hands something to do besides worry. Soon you have a cheerful blaze crackling in the stone circle, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees and holding the darkness at bay. The simple meal of bread and dried meat tastes better than it has any right to after the day you've had. Perhaps it's the mountain air, or perhaps it's simply the relief of having survived another day when so many others haven't. Your mother unwraps the cheese carefully, dividing it into 3 equal portions with the precision of someone who knows every crumb might matter before this journey is over. As full darkness settles over the mountains, the sounds of the night begin to emerge. Owls calling from the treetops, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Somewhere in the distance, the howl of a wolf, long and mournful and wild. It should be frightening, but after the day you've had, these natural sounds feel almost comforting. At least wolves kill for food, not from some incomprehensible malice that strikes at random and shows no mercy. Your father takes the first watch while you and your mother try to get what rest you can in the lean-to. The structure is crude but solid, built by hunters or travelers over the years, and maintained by the unspoken code of the road. You wrap yourself in your cloak and try to ignore the cold seeping up from the ground, and the way every sound seems magnified in the darkness. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and filled with dreams of plague-ravaged faces and empty villages. You wake several times to the sound of your mother crying quietly in her sleep, processing the grief of leaving everything behind. Each time, you lie awake for long minutes listening to the sounds of the night and wondering what tomorrow will bring. Dawn comes gray and cold, with a thin mist rising from the valley below. Your father is already up, tending the fire and preparing for another day of walking. His face looks older in the morning light, marked by a night of worry and broken sleep. None of you has slept well, but rest was a luxury you couldn't really afford anyway. The second day of travel takes you deeper into the mountains, following roads that grow progressively narrower and more difficult. The cart tracks disappear entirely, replaced by footpaths meant for hunters and shepherds rather than fleeing refugees. This is both a blessing and a curse. You're less likely to encounter other travelers who might be carrying disease, but you're also entering country where a wrong turn could mean getting lost in the wilderness. Your father seems confident of the way, though it's been years since he last visited his brother's farm. He points out landmarks he remembers from his youth: a distinctive rock formation, a lightning-struck pine, a stream that runs red with iron ore. Each familiar sight brings a little more hope that you're heading in the right direction, that there might actually be sanctuary waiting at the end of this journey. The higher you climb, the cleaner the air seems to become. Gone is the sweet, cloying smell of death that hung over your village. Gone are the sounds of weeping and the constant tolling of funeral bells. Up here, The world still feels wild and clean, untouched by the plague that's sweeping across the civilized lands below. It's almost possible to believe that the pestilence might not be able to follow you into these remote heights. Almost. By midday, you're walking through country that seems completely untouched by human hands. Ancient forests of pine and oak stretch away on either side of the narrow path. Clear streams cascade down rocky slopes, their water so pure it seems to sparkle in the filtered sunlight. Birds call from the branches overhead, their songs uncomplicated by fear or grief. It's beautiful in a way that makes your heart ache for what the lower world has lost. But even this pristine wilderness can't completely erase the weight of what you've left behind. Every few hours, one of you will mention someone from the village, wondering if old Henrik managed to escape before the sickness claimed him, worrying about the children you saw by the well, speculating about which houses might still be standing when you return. If you return. Your mother has grown quieter as the day progresses, speaking only when spoken to and then only in monosyllables. You can see the grief working in her, the slow realization that the life she's known for 30 years has ended as surely as if she died herself. Everything familiar and comfortable and safe has been stripped away, replaced by uncertainty and hardship, and the constant threat of death following close behind. Your father tries to maintain an optimistic tone, talking about Hugh's farm and how good it will be to see family again after so long. But you can hear the strain in his voice, the forced cheer of a man trying to keep his family's spirits up when his own heart is heavy with loss. He's always been the strong one, the one who makes the hard decisions and bears the weight of responsibility. But even he has limits, and you can see him approaching them. The afternoon brings a new challenge in the form of weather. Clouds have been building all day, growing thicker and darker as they roll over the mountain peaks. What started as a pleasant autumn day has turned gray and threatening, with the kind of heavy sky that promises cold rain or even early snow. The wind picks up, rattling the bare branches and sending leaves swirling across the path in miniature whirlwinds. Your father keeps glancing at the sky with increasing concern. Getting caught in a storm this high in the mountains could be deadly, especially for travelers with limited supplies and no real shelter. He begins to push the pace, urging you and your mother to walk faster despite your aching legs and burning lungs. Every step becomes a race against the approaching weather. The first drops of rain begin to fall just as you crest a ridge and catch sight of smoke rising from a distant valley. Your father stops abruptly, shading his eyes with his hand as he peers into the gray distance. His face breaks into the first genuine smile you've seen since leaving home. Hugh's farm, he says, and the relief in his voice is unmistakable. We made it. We actually made it. The sight of that thin column of smoke rising into the darkening sky fills you with a hope so intense it's almost painful. Somewhere down in that valley is warmth and shelter and family. Somewhere down there is a place where you might be able to rest and recover and figure out how to rebuild your shattered lives. The rain begins to fall harder, but suddenly it doesn't matter. You're almost there. The descent into the valley takes another hour, the narrow path winding back and forth down the steep slope in a series of switchbacks that test your already tired legs. The rain turns into a steady downpour, soaking through your clothes and making the path treacherous with mud and loose stones. But your destination is in sight now, a cluster of stone buildings nestled in a natural bowl between the mountains, smoke still rising from what must be the main house. Uncle Hugh's farm is exactly as you remember it from your last visit, though perhaps a little more weathered around the edges. The house is built of gray stone with a slate roof, designed to withstand the harsh mountain winters. There's a barn for the animals, a shed for tools and supplies, and several smaller outbuildings whose purposes you can't quite recall. The whole complex has an air of solid permanence, as if it has grown out of the mountainside itself and plans to stay there forever. As you approach the house, a dog begins barking somewhere inside. Not the frantic barking of alarm, but the deep, steady baying of a hound that has detected visitors on the property. The sound brings a figure to the door, a tall, lean man with graying hair, and the kind of deeply weathered face that comes from spending a lifetime outdoors in all weather. Uncle Hugh looks older than you remember, but then again, it's been 2 years since you last saw him. He stands in his doorway for a long moment, squinting through the rain at the three figures approaching his farm. Recognition dawns slowly on his face, followed by surprise and then something that might be concern. "Brother," he calls out as you draw close enough for conversation, "what brings you to my door in such weather? And why do you look like refugees fleeing a war?" His voice carries the slight mountain accent you remember, along with a dry humor that suggests he already suspects the answer to his questions. Your father's response is simple and devastating. "The plague has come to Millbrook," he says. "We're all that's left." The words hang in the rain-soaked air like a pronouncement of doom, and you can see Uncle Hugh's face change as their full implications sink in. Without another word, Hugh steps aside and waves you into his house. The interior is warm and dry and filled with the comforting smells of cooking food and wood smoke. After 2 days of travel and terror, it feels like stepping into paradise. You stand dripping on the stone floor while Hugh closes the door against the storm, suddenly overwhelmed by the simple blessing of being inside, being safe, being among family. The main room of Hugh's house serves as kitchen, dining room, and sitting room all in one. A large fireplace dominates one wall, with a kettle hanging over the flames and the mouth-watering aroma of stew filling the air. Simple wooden furniture, a table, benches, a few chairs, provides basic comfort without unnecessary luxury. It's the home of a working man who values function over form, but there's a sense of solidity and security here that your village cottage never quite achieved. Hugh bustles about, bringing you towels and dry clothes while his wife Mary, not to be confused with the baker's wife of the same name, prepares bowls of the stew. Mary is a small, quiet woman with intelligent eyes and hands that never seem to be idle. She listens to the brief account of your journey without comment, but you can see the horror growing in her expression as the story unfolds. The hot food tastes like salvation after 2 days of cold travel rations. Rich broth thick with vegetables and meat, fresh bread still warm from the oven, milk from Hugh's own cows. Your body begins to thaw from the inside out as the warmth spreads through your chest and limbs. For the first time since leaving home, you allow yourself to believe that you might actually survive this catastrophe. But even here, In this remote mountain sanctuary, the plague casts its shadow. Hugh has heard stories, rumors carried by the few travelers who pass this way. Towns along the main roads completely abandoned. Trade routes severed as merchants refused to venture into infected territories. Entire regions falling silent as the pestilence burns through them like fire through dry grass. "How bad is it really?" Hugh asks quietly, and your father's answer is stark in its simplicity. "Worse than you can imagine, and spreading faster than anyone thought possible." He describes what you saw in those final days in the village, the speed with which neighbors sickened and died, the breakdown of all normal social bonds as fear replaced compassion, the sense that civilization itself was crumbling. Mary crosses herself repeatedly as she listens, her lips moving in silent prayer. Hugh's face grows grimmer with each detail, and you can see him calculating, planning, preparing for the possibility that even this remote refuge might not be safe forever. He's a practical man, your uncle, the kind who thinks 3 steps ahead and always has a contingency plan. That night, sleeping in a real bed for the first time in days, you dream of home. Not the plague-ravaged village you fled, but the home of your childhood. Sunny days in the fields, market days with their crowds and laughter, festival days when the whole community came together in celebration. You wake with tears on your cheeks, grieving not just for the people who died, but for a way of life that has been lost forever. The next few days pass in a strange kind of suspended animation. You help with the daily chores around the farm, grateful for work that keeps your hands busy and your mind occupied. There's wood to be split and stacked for the coming winter, animals to be fed and tended, repairs to be made on buildings and equipment. The rhythm of agricultural life is soothing after the chaos of recent events, providing structure and purpose when everything else seems uncertain. But even as you settle into this temporary routine, the outside world continues to intrude. A traveling priest stops at the farm, his news confirming your worst fears. The plague has reached the regional center, a prosperous town that served as a hub for trade and communication. Half the population is dead, the other half fled or dying. The bishop himself succumbed just days ago, found in his cathedral still clutching his crucifix. A merchant's cart passes by, its driver wild-eyed with exhaustion and fear. He speaks of roads blocked by abandoned wagons, bridges collapsed or burned to prevent the spread of infection, entire districts of cities left to burn, while the survivors huddle behind hastily erected barriers. The normal networks of trade and communication that held society together have snapped like overstretched rope, leaving isolated pockets of survivors to fend for themselves. Each new report is worse than the last, painting a picture of civilization in complete collapse. You begin to understand that this isn't simply a disease that will run its course and leave the world to rebuild. This is something that has fundamentally changed the nature of human existence, a catastrophe so complete that the world you knew can never be restored. Uncle Hugh takes these reports with grim stoicism, but you can see him making preparations. He quietly increases the stockpile of preserved food, checks, and rechecks his stores of grain and salt and other essentials. He spends long hours with his tools, sharpening and cleaning and organizing as if preparing for a siege. Most tellingly, He begins teaching you and your father how to use the hunting bow and the crossbow he keeps for protection against wolves and bears. The lessons are practical but sobering. In the old world, your family lived by farming and trade, settled people who solved problems through negotiation and cooperation. But that world is gone, replaced by one where survival might depend on the ability to defend what you have from those who would take it. Hugh's mountain isolation, once a choice made for love of solitude and independence, has become a fortress against a world gone mad. Your mother struggles more than anyone with this new reality. She was raised to be gentle, to trust in God's providence and the basic goodness of her neighbors. The idea that other human beings might come to their door not as guests seeking hospitality, but as predators seeking plunder is almost incomprehensible to her. She spends long hours in prayer, seeking answers in Scripture for questions that have no easy solutions. As October fades into November, the first real snow begins to fall in the high country. What starts as a light dusting in the morning has turned into a steady snowfall by evening, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Under normal circumstances, you might find it beautiful, the way the snow transforms the familiar landscape into something magical and otherworldly. But these aren't normal circumstances, and the snow represents another barrier between you and any hope of return to the life you once knew. Hugh seems almost relieved by the weather. Winter will slow the spread, he says, watching the thick flakes fall past the window. Disease moves with people, and people don't travel much in mountain snow. There's wisdom in his words, but also a cold pragmatism that speaks to how much the world has changed. You're not just hopping for winter to bring its usual renewal and rest. You're hopping it will bring death to your enemies. The snow continues for 3 days, piling up against the buildings and transforming the farm into an island of warmth and light in a wilderness of white. By the time it stops, the drifts are knee-deep in the valley floor and probably much deeper on the higher slopes. Any travelers still on the roads when the storm hit are likely dead by now, frozen in their tracks or lost in the blinding whirl of wind and snow. It's during this enforced isolation that you begin to confront the full magnitude of what you've lost. Not just your home and possessions, but your entire identity. You were a farmer's child from Millbrook, part of a community that stretched back generations, connected to the land and the people by bonds that seemed as permanent as the stones in the church wall. Now you're just another refugee, dependent on the charity of relatives, with no clear sense of what comes next. The realization brings a grief so profound it's almost physical. You find yourself weeping at unexpected moments, while feeding the chickens, while splitting firewood, while helping Mary prepare the evening meal. It's not just sadness for the dead, though that's part of it. It's mourning for your own lost self, the person you were before the world ended, and you had to become someone harder and more desperate just to survive. Your parents are dealing with their own versions of the same loss. Your father, who took such pride in his reputation as a skilled farmer and fair dealer, now has no fields to tend and no community to serve. Your mother, who found meaning in her role as wife and neighbor and member of the church, has been cut loose from all the relationships that defined her. They're both trying to adapt, to find new purposes in this strange new life, but the adjustment is painful to watch. Hugh and Mary do their best to make you feel welcome, but you can see the strain in their faces too. They've spent their adult lives building a life of careful self-sufficiency, producing exactly what they need and no more. The addition of 3 more mouths to feed has upset that delicate balance, especially with winter coming on and no chance to increase the harvest. They're generous people, but generosity has its limits when survival is at stake. The tension comes to a head one evening in late November, during a conversation about plans for the spring. Hugh is talking about expanding the garden and perhaps clearing another field for grain when your father suddenly interrupts. "We can't stay here," he says, his voice heavy with resignation. "This isn't our home, and we can't keep taking from your stores indefinitely." The words hang in the air like a challenge, and you can see Hugh's relief at having the issue finally spoken aloud. But Mary surprises everyone by speaking up before Hugh can respond. "Where else would you go?" she asks quietly. "Every place we've heard from is either dead or dying. At least here you're alive. At least here you're among family." Her voice carries a gentle authority that reminds you why Hugh chose such a strong woman as his partner in this hard mountain life. The discussion that follows is painful but necessary. Resources are indeed limited, but they're not desperate yet. The harvest was good this year, and Hugh's hunting and trapping have provided a steady supply of meat. If everyone works together and if the winter isn't unusually harsh, there should be enough to see all of you through until spring. And by spring, perhaps the world will have begun to stabilize again. It's a fragile hope, but it's something to hold onto during the long, dark months ahead. You throw yourself into the work of winter survival with newfound determination, learning skills you never needed in your old life. How to tan hides for leather. How to preserve meat with salt and smoke. How to repair and maintain the tools and equipment that mean the difference between comfort and misery in the wilderness. December brings news that shakes even Hugh's stoic composure. A lone traveler, more dead than alive, stumbles to their door in the midst of a howling blizzard. He's fleeing from what was once a thriving monastery in the valley 20 miles to the east. The entire community of monks, 47 men who had devoted their lives to God and learning, died within a single week. The traveler had been their lay servant, the only one who survived because he was away gathering firewood when the plague reached their walls. His account of those final days is almost too horrible to believe. Men of God, who had faced death with serene acceptance for decades, reduced to animal panic as the disease consumed them one by one. The abbot himself, a man renowned for his wisdom and piety, found dead in the chapel with his fingernails torn from clawing at the stone floor in his final agony. Bodies left unburied because there was no one left with the strength to dig graves. The traveler stays only long enough to rest and recover some of his strength, then continues on his journey to nowhere in particular. But his presence has contaminated your refuge in a way that goes beyond any physical disease. If the plague could reach a remote monastery, hidden away in the mountains and protected by walls and prayer, then nowhere is truly safe. The enemy isn't just disease, it's the randomness of fate itself. The darkest days of winter bring the darkest thoughts. You lie awake at night listening to the wind howl around the stone walls and wonder if you're just delaying the inevitable. Perhaps everyone in the world will eventually succumb to this pestilence. Perhaps you're the last few humans alive, clinging to existence in this tiny pocket of warmth while death stalks the frozen landscape outside, patient and inexorable. But dawn always comes, even in the depths of winter, and with it the return of routine and purpose. There are animals to tend, fires to maintain, food to prepare. Life, however precarious, continues to make its demands. You find comfort in the small rituals that mark the passage of days, the morning milking, the evening prayers, the sharing of meals around the wooden table. Christmas passes quietly, marked only by a small feast of preserved goose and Mary's carefully hoarded supply of honey. There's no priest to say Mass, no community to celebrate with, no gifts beyond the simple blessing of being alive and together. Yet the day feels sacred in ways you hadn't expected, stripped of its usual pageantry, and reduced to its essential meaning, the promise of hope in the midst of darkness. Your mother seems to find some peace in the religious observance, and she begins to speak more often of God's plan and the necessity of faith in times of trial. You envy her ability to find meaning in suffering, to believe that this catastrophe serves some divine purpose. Your own faith feels brittle and uncertain, tested by the reality of good people dying for no reason while others survive through mere chance. January brings a brief thaw that turns the snow to slush and fills the air with the sound of running water. For a few days, the world seems to be waking from its frozen sleep, and you allow yourself to think about spring and renewal and the possibility of a future beyond mere survival. But then the temperature drops again, harder than before, and the brief hope is encased in ice. It's during this cold snap that you make a discovery that changes everything. While exploring the upper reaches of the farm, looking for signs of the wolves that have been troubling the sheep, you find something that shouldn't be there. Footprints in the snow, human footprints, recent ones. Someone has been watching the farm from the ridge above, someone who knows how to move quietly and stay hidden. You report the discovery to Hugh immediately, and his reaction confirms your worst fears. This isn't the first time he's found such signs. For weeks now, he's been noticing small disturbances that suggest the presence of strangers in the area. Broken branches, disturbed snow, the feeling of being watched that raises the hair on the back of your neck. He's been hopping he was imagining things, but your independent confirmation makes denial impossible. The discussion that follows is tense and frightening. Who could be out there in the winter wilderness, and what do they want? The most likely explanation is also the most disturbing. Other survivors, probably armed and definitely desperate, who have decided that taking what they need is easier than trying to produce it themselves. The farm, with its stores of food and fuel and its obvious signs of prosperity, would be an irresistible target for such people. Hugh begins making preparations immediately. Windows are barricaded with heavy shutters. Weapons are checked and positioned at strategic points around the house. Plans are made for defending the buildings or, if necessary, for escape into the higher mountains where pursuing enemies might freeze before catching up. The comfortable farmhouse begins to feel more like a fortress under siege. The attack, when it comes, arrives with the next storm. You're awakened in the pre-dawn darkness by the sound of the dog barking furiously, then yelping in pain, then falling silent. Hugh is already up and moving, crossbow in hand, calling for everyone to take their positions at the windows. Through the whirling snow, you can see dark shapes moving around the outbuildings, at least 6 or 7 of them, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge. The siege lasts all day, a nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse played out in the midst of a blizzard. The attackers are smart enough not to make a direct assault on the house, which is well built and easily defended. Instead, they try to starve you out, setting fire to the hay store and slaughtering most of the livestock they can catch. Each loss is a blow not just to your immediate safety, but to your chances of surviving the rest of the winter. Your father proves surprisingly effective with the bow Hugh taught him to use, putting an arrow through the shoulder of one attacker who got too careless in his approach to the chicken coop. But you're badly outnumbered, and everyone knows this can only end one way unless something changes soon. The attackers have nothing to lose and all winter to wait you out. You have a warm shelter to defend but limited ammunition and supplies that grow smaller with every passing hour. The breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. Your mother, who has been praying steadily throughout the siege, suddenly stands up from her position by the back window and walks toward the door. Before anyone can stop her, she lifts the bar and steps outside into the storm, her prayer book clutched in her hands like a shield. "Stop," she shouts, her voice carrying clearly through the wind. "Stop this madness. We're all Christians here, all children of God. This is not the way." The attackers freeze, clearly not expecting this response to their assault. A woman walking unarmed into their midst, speaking of God and mercy while they're trying to murder her family, is so far outside their expectations that they don't know how to respond. What follows is one of the strangest negotiations in human history, conducted in whispers through a snowstorm between desperate people who have all lost everything they once held dear. The attackers, it turns out, are survivors from a trading town that was completely destroyed by plague 6 weeks ago. They've been living rough in the mountains ever since, watching their number dwindle as hunger and cold claimed more victims than disease ever did. They're not evil people, just desperate ones, driven to extremes by circumstances beyond their control. When your mother speaks to them of shared suffering and mutual aid, of the Christian duty to help one another in times of trial, she touches something in them that desperation hadn't quite managed to kill. The leader, a blacksmith named Marcus whose wife and children died in the plague, begins to weep as she talks. The resolution, when it comes, is both practical and profound. The attackers will put down their weapons and help repair the damage they've caused. In return, you'll share what food and shelter you have, knowing that it means a hungrier winter for everyone, but also knowing that turning away fellow survivors would be a betrayal of everything that makes life worth preserving. It's a gamble that could doom you all, but it's also an affirmation of the values that separate humans from beasts. The weeks that follow are difficult beyond description. 13 people trying to survive in a space designed for 5, with supplies calculated for 5, through what turns out to be one of the harshest winters in living memory. Every meal is carefully rationed. Every scrap of fuel is precious. Privacy becomes a luxury that no one can afford, and tempers fray as the walls close in and the cold deepens. But somehow, against all odds, it works. Marcus proves his worth by repairing tools and weapons with a skill that Hugh lacks. Two of the other men are experienced hunters who know the mountain game trails better than anyone. The women help with the endless work of food preparation and clothing repair that keeps everyone alive. Children who had been orphaned by the plague find new families among the survivors, bonds forged by shared hardship that prove stronger than blood. You discover abilities in yourself that you never knew existed. Not just practical skills like tracking and trapping, though you learn those too, but deeper capacities for endurance and adaptation and hope. The boy who left Millbrook in terror would barely recognize the person you're becoming, harder in some ways, but also more resilient, more aware of what really matters when everything else is stripped away. February brings the worst storms of the winter, howling gales that pile snow against the windows and make the house shake like a ship in a storm. For days at a time, no one can venture outside except to tend the animals, and the enforced confinement tests everyone's sanity. But you've learned to find entertainment in simple things, stories told around the fire, songs remembered from happier times, games carved from scraps of wood that help pass the endless dark hours. It's during one of these storytelling sessions that you realize something important has changed. The stories being told aren't just about the past anymore, about the world that was lost to plague and chaos. They're beginning to include the present, the small victories and discoveries and relationships that have emerged from the ashes of the old life. People are starting to imagine a future again, to make plans that extend beyond simple survival. Marcus talks about establishing a smithy in the valley come spring, using the iron or Hugh has found in the local streams. One of the women, skilled in weaving, discusses the possibility of raising sheep for wool as well as meat. The children, who adapt faster than adults to any situation, are already talking about where they'll build their own houses when they grow up, taking it for granted that there will be a community here worth being part of. March arrives with a sudden warmth that sets the snow to melting and fills the streams with rushing water. The sun, which seemed like a pale, distant memory during the worst of winter, begins to show real strength again. You can smell earth under the snow, the rich, dark promise of soil waiting to be planted. Spring is coming, and with it the possibility of renewal. The first travelers of the new year arrive in late March, a small group of traders who somehow managed to survive the winter in a cave system, 20 miles to the south. Their news is mixed. Many places remain completely empty ghost towns, where the wind blows through empty houses and wild animals reclaim the streets. But other locations are showing signs of recovery, small groups of survivors banding together to rebuild some semblance of civilization from the ruins. They're particularly interested in the community you've built here, the way different groups of survivors have managed to merge into a functioning unit. Trade, they suggest, might be possible again within a few years as the scattered remnants of humanity begin to reconnect. The iron ore Marcus has been experimenting with could be valuable, as could the high-quality furs Hugh traps in the deep forest. As April progresses and the snow continues to retreat, you begin venturing farther from the farm to assess the possibilities for expansion. The valley has good water and protection from the worst weather, and there's plenty of room for more fields if the community continues to grow. Marcus has already identified several sites where a proper smithy could be built, taking advantage of the mountain streams for water power. But the most significant discovery comes when you climb to the ridge where you first spotted the attacker's footprints months ago. Looking down at the farm from that vantage point, you can see what you couldn't see from ground level, the beginnings of a real village. The main house anchored by several smaller structures that have been built or adapted over the winter months. Garden plots marked out and ready for planting. A network of paths connecting the various buildings and work areas. Without quite realizing it, you've become founders. Not just survivors, but the seed of something new, something that might grow into a community that could last for generations. The thought is both thrilling and terrifying, to be responsible not just for your own survival, but for the survival of a way of life that seemed lost forever. May brings the first real warmth of the year, and with it a sense of cautious optimism that no one dare speak aloud. The gardens are planted with seeds saved from Hugh's stores and others traded from passing travelers. The livestock, reduced by winter losses and the attack, begins to recover as fresh grass becomes available. Most importantly, no one has died of plague or any other disease since the survivors merged into a single community. You begin to think about the future in concrete terms for the first time in months. Where will you build your own house when you're ready to marry and start a family? What skills should you develop to be most useful to the community? How can the lessons learned from this terrible year be preserved and passed on to children who will hopefully never face such trials? The answers, you realize, will depend on whether this fragile recovery can sustain itself through the challenges that surely lie ahead. Other survivors will undoubtedly find their way to the valley, some seeking shelter and some seeking plunder. The weather will sometimes be harsh, the harvest sometimes poor, the isolation sometimes oppressive. Disease might return, or war, or any of the other horsemen that have plagued humanity throughout history. But you've learned something valuable in this year of loss and rebuilding. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding hope in the darkest circumstances and building meaning from the fragments of shattered dreams. The world that existed before the plague is gone forever, but the world that's emerging to replace it might be something worth preserving in its own right. June arrives with a burst of green growth that transforms the valley into something approaching paradise. The gardens flourish in the long mountain days, and the forests teem with game that has multiplied in the absence of human pressure. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, you feel something approaching contentment, a sense that this place and these people might actually become home. The final test of the community's resilience comes in late June, when a larger group of travelers arrive seeking shelter and aid. Nearly 30 people this time, survivors from multiple locations who have banded together for mutual protection during their journey to find a place to settle permanently. They've heard rumors of the community you've built, stories that have grown in the telling, until you're described as something approaching a miracle of cooperation and prosperity. The reality, of course, is more modest than the legend. Resources are still tight, space is limited, and the social dynamics of the existing community are still fragile after less than a year together. Adding 30 more people, with their own histories and needs and expectations, threatens to upset the delicate balance that has allowed you all to survive and begin to thrive. But the alternative, turning away fellow survivors to face an uncertain fate on the dangerous roads, is unthinkable after everything you've experienced. The decision, when it's made, reflects the values that have sustained the community through its darkest moments. You'll find a way to make it work, even if that means shorter rations and harder work and more difficult winters ahead. The expansion transforms the valley almost overnight. New shelters spring up like mushrooms after rain, built with the help of experienced hands and the urgency of people who know that winter will come again whether they're ready or not. The gardens are expanded, the hunting grounds organized more systematically, the water sources developed to serve a larger population. You find yourself taking on leadership responsibilities you never sought but somehow seem suited for. Perhaps it's because you were among the first to arrive and have learned the rhythms of mountain life. Perhaps it's because your experience with the original attack and integration taught you something about balancing different needs and perspectives. Or perhaps it's simply because someone has to make the hard decisions, and you're willing to bear that burden. As summer progresses and the community settles into its new configuration, you begin to see the outlines of something that might endure. Not just a collection of survivors huddled together for warmth, but a genuine society with its own customs and structures and dreams for the future. Children learn trades from master craftsmen. Adults form partnerships and alliances that go beyond mere convenience. The elderly find respect and purpose as keepers of knowledge and wisdom. The first wedding in the new community takes place in July, a celebration that would have been simple by old-world standards but feels magnificent in its current context. Marcus, the former blacksmith who led the winter attack, marries Sarah, one of the women who arrived with the June refugees. The ceremony is performed by your mother, who has become something of a spiritual leader in the absence of any ordained clergy. It's during the wedding feast that you realize how much has changed, not just in the external circumstances of your life, but in your own understanding of what makes existence meaningful. The food is simple, and the entertainment basic, but the sense of community celebration is richer than any festival you remember from your childhood. These people have chosen to bind their lives together not through accident of birth or proximity, but through deliberate commitment forged in the crucible of shared hardship. August brings the first harvest from the expanded gardens, a success that exceeds even the most optimistic projections. The mountain soil, enriched by centuries of forest growth and relatively untouched by intensive cultivation, proves remarkably fertile when properly worked. The long summer days and cool nights create ideal growing conditions for many crops, and the isolation that once seemed like a curse now appears to be a blessing in disguise. As you work alongside your neighbors to bring in the grain and vegetables, you're struck by how different this harvest feels from those of your childhood. Then, it was simply the culmination of the annual cycle, expected and routine, and taken largely for granted. Now, each plant that survives to maturity represents a victory over death and chaos, a small affirmation that life can continue even after the world ends. The abundance creates new possibilities and new challenges. For the first time, the community produces more food than it can immediately consume, raising questions about storage and preservation, and trade with other survivor communities. There's talk of sending expeditions to explore the wider region, to map the current state of recovery and identify opportunities for cooperation or mutual aid. You volunteer for the first such expedition, partly from curiosity about the world beyond the valley, but mainly from a growing sense of responsibility for the community's future. If this place is going to survive and prosper, it needs connections to the outside world, trade relationships and alliances that can provide both markets for surplus goods and sources for items that can't be produced locally. The expedition sets out in early September, just 6 people with supplies for a month-long journey through the mountains and down into the lower valleys, where most human activity was once concentrated. The contrast with your desperate flight from Millbrook nearly a year ago is striking. Then you were refugees fleeing disaster. Now you're explorers and ambassadors representing a functioning community. The world you discover is both better and worse than you expected. Many places remain completely empty, ghost towns, where nature is already beginning to reclaim the structures humans abandoned. But other locations show clear signs of recovery, sometimes more advanced than your own. A monastery that survived by closing its gates early and maintaining strict isolation. A fortified town that fought off multiple attacks and emerged stronger than before. Even a few places where some version of normal commerce has resumed. Most importantly, you encounter other communities like your own, groups of survivors who have banded together to create something new from the ruins of the old world. Each has developed its own solutions to the challenges of post-plague existence, and each has lessons that could benefit the others. The foundation of what might eventually become a new civilization is taking shape, built not on the grand institutions of the past, but on the intimate relationships of people who have chosen to trust each other with their lives. You return to the valley in late September with your head full of possibilities, and your pack full of trade goods that couldn't be produced in your mountain isolation. Salt from coastal communities that survived by fishing. Metal tools from settlements with access to forges and ore. Books and manuscripts saved from the libraries of destroyed cities. Most precious of all, seeds of crops that could diversify your agriculture and reduce your dependence on hunting and gathering. The welcome you receive confirms something you've begun to suspect over the past months. This place really has become home in a way that goes deeper than mere residence. The faces lighting up as you return, the eager questions about what you've seen, the immediate mobilization to help unpack and distribute the goods you've brought back, all speak to the reality of genuine community bonds. October arrives with the crisp air and brilliant colors that make mountain autumns legendary, but also with the sobering knowledge that another winter is approaching. This one will be different. The community is larger and better supplied, with more skilled hands to share the work and more experience to guide the preparations. But it will also be a test of whether the social structures that have evolved over the past year can withstand the pressure of close confinement and resource competition. You throw yourself into the winter preparations with an intensity that surprises even you, driven by a determination to ensure that everyone who depends on this community will survive to see another spring. Food stores are expanded and diversified. Fuel supplies are increased and better organized. The physical infrastructure of the settlement is strengthened and weatherproofed. Most importantly, the social infrastructure is reinforced through shared work and celebration and planning for the future. The first snow falls in late October, earlier than last year but not unexpected at this altitude. As you watch the flakes settle on the buildings and gardens you've helped to create, you feel a profound sense of completion. Not the completion of a task finished, but the completion of a transformation accomplished. The terrified refugee who fled a dying village has become someone who helps build living communities. The child who took security for granted has become an adult who understands its value and is willing to work to preserve it. November brings the news that will define the next phase of your story, carried by the last travelers to reach the valley before winter closes the passes. Word has spread throughout the region about the community you've built, and various groups are making plans to visit when spring returns. Some come as potential allies seeking trade or mutual aid. Others represent threats, organized bands of raiders who have decided that taking from the productive is easier than trying to produce for themselves. The prospect of conflict is sobering but not terrifying in the way it would have been a year ago. You've learned that survival often requires difficult choices, and that good people sometimes have to do hard things to protect what matters most. The community has weapons now, and people who know how to use them, and perhaps most importantly, the will to defend what you've all worked so hard to build. As December arrives and the snow begins to pile up outside the warm buildings, you settle in for another long winter with a sense of cautious confidence. The challenges ahead are real and serious, but they're the challenges of success rather than failure, the problems of a community that has too much to lose rather than one that has nothing left to hope for. You've learned to find satisfaction in simple things: a well-built fire on a cold night, a meal shared among friends, the sound of children laughing as they play games by lamplight. But you've also learned to think in terms of legacy and continuity, to consider what kind of world you're building for the generations that will follow. The plague took away the world you were born into, but in its place, you're creating something that might prove more resilient and more humane than what came before. The story that began with the tolling of funeral bells in a dying village has become something else entirely, a story of renewal and community, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender hope even in the face of overwhelming darkness. It's not the story you expected to live, but it's the one that has made you who you are. And as you look ahead to the challenges and opportunities that await in the spring, you find yourself grateful for every difficult lesson that brought you to this moment of quiet confidence in the heart of winter's deepest darkness.